monitoring Scrum, monitoring sprints, the Scrum board, the Burndown chart, the average velocity chart. Dan's Scrum team is working hard to complete their first sprint. They're well on their way to building a potentially shippable increment. But with all these people working at the same time, and with a non-hierarchical progress structure, who's minding the store? How do we monitor what the team's doing? In Scrum, the team works collaboratively to monitor their own progress in a way that's open for everyone to see. Monitoring sprint progress helps the team understand if they will be able to deliver on their commitments and to do improvements sooner than later. Reports such as the Sprint Burndown chart, the Release Burndown chart, and if you're using software tools, there's dashboard widgets, all to help the team get real-time progress from a single source of truth. How many story points have been completed compared with the total required for the sprint? It acts like a wall map that tells everyone, where are we and when are we going to get there? Nowadays, many Scrum teams work virtually, with team members in different locations around the country or potentially all around the world. Thank you, Skype. If your team is spread out like this, your daily stand-up will instead be a daily Skype or other conference call service. But you will still try to schedule it at the beginning of most members' workday. Also, if your team is off-site, instead of having an analog Scrum board, you'll work digitally, using one of a number of shared calendars, shared workspaces, like the cloud-based Cognosco app. If your team is local, your product owner will build a Scrum board for your team room, some place where the team members can see it throughout the day. It's also a good plan to put it in the place where you have your daily stand-up. It's common to refer to it often during these talks. You'll make it out of your own combination of some large board and tape and a straight edge and cards or Post-it notes of different colors and different sizes, and maybe you'll print up a thumbnail picture of all the team members. Across the top, you'll put the column headings Story, Not Started, In Progress, and Done. You'll make a card or sticky note for each story you committed to in the current sprint. Now, let's put user stories on the board, one per card. You'll pick one of your colors and stay consistent with that. Use larger sticky notes for the stories, and in big letters with a dark marker, you'll write some headline version of the story, a title to easily see from a distance. Then in smaller print, you can write out the whole user story so anyone could read the whole sentence if they wanted. Write the story point estimate on the card in a different color marker if you have one. Now, in the first column of your table, the one labeled Story, we're going to post the user stories from the highest to lowest priority. And we'll leave a little space in between them, because over time, we'll be creating rows that will get filled up with multiple notes. Each row here will represent the journey taken by each story in the first column. Next, create a card or sticky note for each task you've identified. These too should have a headline or title at the top in big letters. Then the full details underneath. Each of these task cards is posted on the Scrum board in the next column, Not Started. Then, as tasks are assigned to members, either write their initial on the task card or attach their thumbnail picture onto it. As team members accept a task, the cards get moved into the In Progress column. When the task is done, he'll move it into the Done column and likely choose another task to start. The basic board should look something like this. Sometimes, for better or worse, surprises happen. But since we're using Scrum, which is an Agile framework, we have a way for monitoring that too, although your Scrum Master should try to protect the team from this. If you do end up with an unplanned task, something outside of your sprint commitment, but which still has to be addressed immediately, you can track it on your Scrum board by including a row called Expedite. When something new appears in the Not Started column on the Expedite row, the team swarms on that item rather than stories in order to get it done as soon as possible. Your product owner will make the call, but if the urgency of a surprise item is less than completing the sprint, you'll add it to the product backlog for another sprint down the road. Some surprises slow down or stop work. Impediments could be anything from waiting for a legal clearance to waiting for an answer from somebody to a technical glitch, a crashed computer, to waiting for someone to get over the flu. Anything that impedes forward motion should be jotted down, maybe using a red note or a red marker, and placed directly on the item that's being blocked. This keeps communication transparent. And if it's on the board, you don't have to always stop and explain everything to everybody, like why is a high priority story still in progress while a low priority story is already done. Other features you might want on your Scrum board include a color code using dots or flags to indicate themes, larger features, dependencies on other teams, etc. Your team might want to limit the number of stories in the pipeline. You could write the Work in Progress limit, or WIP limit, in the header of the In Progress column. With all this moving around and adding to notes, you can see why it matters that you keep your board organized. But why bother with a Scrum board at all? When your teams work together cohesively, it doesn't happen on its own. Having everyone together on the same page saves time and energy. The Scrum board can tell us a few critical things at just a quick glance, like what did we commit to? The stories on the left column show the team's commitment for the sprint. And what are we working on? The presence of task cards in the In Progress column indicates that the team is currently working on the corresponding story. And are we working on the right things? Since stories on the task board are ordered according to their priority in the product backlog, the top stories should be getting to done first. If stories in the middle or at the bottom of the board are done, while stories at the top are not started or in progress, this can indicate a problem. Is anything impeding our work? For example, maybe there's an impediment blocking a high priority story, but no one is talking about it. By monitoring and posting impediments, everyone can see at a glance what's blocked and make sure something is being done about the impediment. The number of stories in progress and the distribution of names reveal whether a team is collaborating or whether each team member is working on her own story. With an expedite row, you can see by the accumulation of cards how much work has been added after the start of the sprint. This may lead the team to discuss with the product owner dropping one or more of the stories on the bottom of the board. But remember, this should be avoided as much as possible. When the team commits to a sprint, we should stick to the commitment for that sprint and try to put unexpected stories in the product backlog, and then pull them into the next sprint, giving it a high priority. A Scrum board should also answer the question, when are we done? Assuming you've created all the tasks for a story to get done, when all of a story's task cards are in the Done column, that indicates that the story is done. Finally, when you're ready for a new task, the board can tell you which stories are open so you can find a way to contribute to the highest priority open stories rather than opening a new story. Another Scrum artifact that is often posted on or near the Scrum board is the Burndown chart. This is a graphical display of the amount of work remaining. It shows how quickly your team is burning down the tasks and user stories. The velocity of work is the slope of the Burndown graph at any point in time. Velocity of work equals the amount of work completed and accepted in points within a time box sprint. For example, 40 points worth of stories were completed and accepted in a 2-week sprint. To improve the velocity of work, attend the daily Scrum meetings. Listen for the impediments and remove them. Listen closely to team members' input. Can anyone help them? Setting dates doesn't improve the velocity of work. Helping the team does. Both the Sprint Burndown chart and the Release Burndown chart operate by showing the remaining effort over time. Different teams will use different wording, but basically the x-axis represents time and the y-axis represents remaining effort. There are a couple of different ways to do this. Here is a chart where the y-axis graphs the number of items. It marks the progress of days in steps, and the dotted line represents the ideal velocity. This ideal arc reflects progress assuming all tasks in the sprint will be completed at a uniform rate. This charting method by steps has some shortcomings. Steps could be smaller if stories are broken down in an appropriate way. This method doesn't accurately express the sprint progress on a day-to-day basis, only at the end of each task. These charts work best when they're fluid and updated daily. On this chart, the y-axis is measured in hours and the x-axis in days. This method of monitoring time provides a more granular view of progress, which is great, but it can promote micromanagement, which is not great. This might be useful for teams new to Scrum. You might want to carefully track time spent and remaining time. But those people asking their team to monitor hours like this should understand the team is hired to develop a real product, not to spend X amounts of time. Therefore, most Scrum teams track a remaining size. This chart displays the remaining size of all stories in a sprint backlog that need to be done using story points. Stories can take different amounts of time to complete and are typically bigger items than tasks. Stories are also said to be done only when all tasks are completed. This leads to stairs in the Burndown chart. Unfortunately, it is easy to evaluate such stairs incorrectly. Management in particular is vulnerable to reading this chart as showing no progress, when in fact it's showing that effort continues but has not yet been completed. More experienced teams work with stories that are enough for a daily synchronization. It is less comprehensive but sufficient. It allows for having shorter daily meetings that are more focused on how much effort remains. It might be helpful to display impediment indicators as well. It's about transparency. Having them on a Burndown chart is a good way to combine them with the progress, giving the sprint overview. The remaining work will not necessarily go down in a neat, straight line. At the beginning of a sprint in particular, your team may discover something new that must be completed for the sprint goal. Or maybe a task just takes longer than anticipated. That happens. So, what else can we learn from Burndown charts? Well, this chart indicates an ideal situation where velocity and estimates match almost perfectly. The team is not overcommitting, and they have a strong understanding of their estimates. This team may not be ideal, but they're still doing great. This chart tells us that their product owner understands the reason for a locked sprint backlog. The team is not overcommitted, and they finished on time. They were able to estimate capacity correctly, but most important, they adapted a scope of the sprint backlog to complete a sprint. At the end, this team has a possibility to complete some additional work. In their retrospective meeting, the team should discuss the reasons of late progress in the first half of the sprint and solve issues so they're better in the next sprint. The team should also consider the capacity that they are able to complete. The result that is more likely to what you'll see your first time out is this chart. It says that the team was able to complete their commitment on time. They adapted the scope or worked harder to complete the sprint. The team was self-reflecting. This team should discuss change of plan immediately as they see the progress has been slowing down from the beginning of the sprint. Typically, it is suggested to move a low priority from the sprint backlog to the next sprint back to the product backlog. And just for comparison, this is what it would look like if you did not complete your sprint. This team did not adapt the scope of the sprint to an appropriate level. This team has not completed stories that should have been split or moved to the next sprint. In such a situation, the next sprint should be smaller. And if this happens again, corrective actions should be taken after a few days when slower progress is observed. Usually, a lower priority story will be moved to the next sprint or to the product backlog. And a team that finishes its sprint early will have a Burndown chart that looks like this. Or if you finish too soon, it might look like this. This team finished its work sooner than expected. The stories were implemented, but the team didn't work on additional stories, even if it had the capacity to do so. The stories were probably overestimated. Therefore, the team finished them earlier. Also, the velocity of the team has not been properly estimated. The Scrum Master must be more proactive in either getting the team to fix estimation or ensure additional stories are ready to be added to the current sprint. Remember, with all these charts, that these are empirical measurements. They tell you what is happening so that you can adjust one of the 4 variables for the next product release: cost, time, functionality, or quality. Monitoring our progress in Scrum by estimating velocity and charting our progress using Burndown charts keeps communication open and expectations in reality. But they should be read and understood correctly so everyone will draw from them the same conclusions. This video, Monitoring Scrum, is the 5th of a 6-part training series on implementing the Scrum framework. The next video in this series, Episode 6, will cover the origins of Scrum, the proper use of Scrum, and the definition of done.